Okay, so part of the economics or the green economy, obviously a big part of the green economy relates to consumption. And what I would describe as the future of consumption, and part of that future has to do with what one could describe as eco-consumption. There are so many products and services nowadays. If you think about eco-tourism, how much is that worth? Everything is eco-friendly, eco-homes, eco-communities and so on. It's actually quite massive if you were to add it up, and partly that's it's true that, say on eco-buildings, yes, they're energy efficient and so on. On eco-tourism, yes, you can go to Costa Rica and yes, you can manage things more effectively in terms of the impact that people might have when they are trampling through the fields and trampling through sort of beautiful coastlines and so on, and chucking their rubbish all over the place, and just generally despoiling, places of natural beauty, which they do, and we've been doing it globally as well as locally. I think that's the thing, we're globalizing it, this rampant kind of thirst, and I'm part of that, I should say. And I think, as we said earlier, we've talked about, is that consumption is about 60% of the economy in terms of GDP. So any tampering with consumption, in the sense that the composition of it or the level of it will affect how the economy actually operates and functions. So, for example, if we were to say, right, we need, our ecological footprints are telling us that we should actually be consuming only half as much as we do. What does that mean for the economy? Because if 60% of the driving force in the economy is consumption, and if we all moved to smaller cars, smaller homes, we kept our cars low and we didn't move around so much, and when we go out we don't shop till we drop, about most of what's actually wasted in the high street. And I don't know how you handle waste. It's a kind of perverse logic that, the biggest industry in this country is waste. If it's waste that's such a big thing, I don't know whether you should be celebrating. Surely we should be moving to a zero waste situation, because a zero waste situation, as Satish Kumar was saying, is actually the mark of a civilized society, not wasting things. But we do. And do you know places like supermarkets like this? At the end of the day, you must have asked yourself, what do they do with all the food that hasn't got eaten? At the end of the day, because there's loads of it, isn't there? And loads of it we would like, wouldn't we? Well, they burn it. That's what they actually do. That's what waste is about, burning food. And my father actually was brought up, a very poor man, always said to me that wasting food, and I'm sure that you'll know as any normal person would say, is a totally immoral activity. So within this economy, this green economy logic, there's an argument about the moral issues about consumption, and whether or not we are, in a sense, a society or an economy built around waste, built around overconsumption. And that, I think, is quite the essence of all of it. So how do we unlearn consumerism? I think this is part of what we should be trying to do. And this is the message coming through from a lot of the economists who are working in these very big frameworks about we consume too much. That's the point. Now, what's interesting, there was a study done looking at individual consumption. So they interviewed a lot of households and lots of people, ordinary people at home, and they asked them, okay, first of all, they took their habits, they looked at what they consumed, they looked at their homes, they looked at how they spent their money, and then they worked out their ecological footprints. So it's ecological footprinting, not at the level of the whole society like we talked about before, but it's actually at the level of the individual. And the idea was to say, hang on a second, do you realise your ecological footprint is almost 5 times bigger than someone in Africa? In other words, you're consuming 5 times, you need 5 times more of the planet to keep you alive than some poor African does. Now you would look at that and say, I need 3.5 more planets just to sustain us all of these people, and people like the average British person. If we were all like eating the same level as some of these Africans, we only need half the planet. So in other words, there are issues here about consumption. So this study went to the individual because ultimately all of this is about behaviour and states of mind. Why do we consume the way we do? Why do we hang on to it? When they asked people, they said, here's your ecological footprint. Aren't you ashamed of yourself for the amount you're eating and eating up the globe's resources and so on? Aren't you ashamed of that? And are you going to change your behaviour as a result? So it's a kind of like a naming and shaming exercise where you're using ecological footprints and say, now look at it. In the same way, you might go to Weight Watchers if, for example, I showed you that you're about 10 tons too overweight. So what happens is you show it to them, and it is interesting because when they talk to these people, about 70% of people said they'd change the way they handle the household waste. Actually, that's not difficult these days because all of the local councils in this country are making it so much easier. So 70% said, yeah, we're going to recycle better, we're going to handle our waste better. Another lot of people, around 60%, were saying that they would actually change their energy, the way they use energy in the home. They'd shut the windows, they'd insulate the loft, they'd do all of these nice things, and maybe even a sort of an outside possibility was actually changing the windows and putting solar panels up or whatever. About 60% said they'd do that. Again, that's low-hanging fruit, in the sense that's a bit easy to do. Another 60% said they'd eat better, so they'd eat stuff produced in local farms, farmers markets. We know that's happening. People are far more health conscious about what they eat and so on. So 60% said they'd improve their kind of the way that they actually ate. And a smaller percentage, less than half, said they would leave the car behind and, you know, for maybe a day a week, actually go by bus or cycle to work or walk to work. Actually, it's hanging on to the car. We don't like. That's something that we won't give up that easily. But what was really amazing about the results of this survey of individual households was only 1% of people are prepared to sacrifice their shopping baskets. Very few people are going to say, we will consume less. When we go to the supermarket, when we go down the shop to High Street, we're not going to consume less. We still want the DVDs. We still want, you know, our fancy organic foods or whatever we want to do with it and so on. We still want to buy clothes that, you know, new clothes just for the sake of it and so on. So in other words, we're not letting go of consumption. And unless we do, particularly in the West and in high-income countries, there is no prospect of a sustainable future for the world as a whole. We're just consuming too much. I think it's interesting, for example, when it comes to some of the statistics on meat eating. America in particular eats a lot of meat, and we eat too much meat. Now meat is actually that meat eating and dairy and meat eating together consume 30% of the land, cultivable land area of the entire world. So meat eating has a huge economic impact on the world's resources, and equally it's the primary source of methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas, and the primary force behind deforestation. So whether you look at things economically or ecologically, it is a disaster area. What's more, the disease is spreading to India and to China. In India, what we've now got, McDonald's, fast food restaurants opening up. India's now becoming an exporter of meat, as is China. China's getting like that as well. So if these big countries start meat eating and getting into it as well, and start fueling this entire meat industry, dairy industry worldwide, my God, you know, I can't imagine just how we're going to feed ourselves by the year 2050, let alone 2030. So this has huge implications. I think there's this entire fashion towards eco-consumption, and I think you see it particularly in what I call the flower power sector, which is all of these botanical products that we now use for our health. They're always marketed as natural products, so you get them in health food stores and naturals. It's a massive industry, these botanical products. These include things like shampoos, and things like bath oils, a variety of medicines, you know, all these natural medicines and so on. in Brazil, the market's growing at 20-30%. In Europe, it's growing 30%. Even in France, where they've been traditionally using natural cosmetics, it's a huge industry. It's worth millions and billions worldwide. And guess what? The people who like this thing particularly, and you can imagine how rampant it could become, are places like India and China, but traditionally they've always relied on these types of medicines. So you've got this huge trade and this huge growth market in these areas, and they are genuinely growing. And as they're growing, and particularly in Brazil, the two biggest producers, the dominant companies in the sector are actually very big companies, and they use the resources that come from the Amazon. Because the Amazon provides a variety of these things. But it's also the traditional, let's say, non-natural cosmetic makers and producers of medicines who are moving into the market, because the nature market has become so important. So, in a sense, this is another part of the green economy, literally part of the green economy, where in effect you've got this explosion of using nature. The downside of a lot of this is the recipes for most of these things, the original medicines, actually come from indigenous peoples and people who are, may live in the Amazon or live somewhere else. And we have basically systematically stolen so much of this knowledge without giving things back. So there's again a downside to all of it, but we are getting this eruption, and this is part of a very big growth sector of the economy. So again, this is it's part of what you describe as ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are all the services that nature provides to humankind, and part of these services are essentially all of these different types of newfangled medicines, cosmetics and so on that are coming and are marketed as natural products and services. Huge markets. I think one of the big and possibly explosive areas, I see it as an explosive area, is the notion of the very idea that nature is an economic sector. I think it contains enough dynamite really to blow traditional economics into orbit. Because it's, in most economics, like neoclassical welfare economics, when we looked at nature, we tended to look at it in terms of the environmental impacts of mainstream economic activities. So it would be like pollution, it would be like degradation of the soil. But we always thought about air quality would be another one, air quality of the sea, pollution really. And what I think is kind of interesting about that is that we tended to see it as an externality. An externality is a side effect. And where, let's say for example, I'm smoking a cigarette and you catch cancer as a result, they would regard that as an externality. And of course we've been internalising externalities, reducing pollution through all kinds of things, environmental regulations and so on. But traditionally that's how it's been, that the nature entered into the picture in terms of a negative externality, the effects of pollution. And that's how a lot of it has been handled. And it still is, actually, seem like that. But the idea of nature being an economic sector is a very different one, which is that it's an integral part of the economy. It's not a result of something that's happened through economic activity. It's actually part of the economy itself. So it's within the mainstream. It's not an externality, it's an internality, like it's internal to the economic system. And that actually has a very different way of looking at things. And the people who've been looking at this kind of thing are the people who've been both government as well as academic researchers and so on, have been looking at something called ecosystem services. These are all the different types of services that nature provides mankind with. And they are essentially services provided by natural systems. So for example, if you look at ecosystem services, there would be nutrient recycling, there'd be soil formation, there'd be things like the provisioning of food and water, there'd be the way that the trees regulate climate change or vegetation does, the way the seas work. There are things like flood and disease regulation, water decontamination, And so, essentially, and all these services are also cultural as well. The fact that we use nature, we go for walks in nature, and all of these things actually are good for our well-being. So nature is good for our well-being, as providing all of these resources. And there's no better example of this than bees, but just the ordinary bumblebee, just the honeybees and so on. The bee population in the UK and the United States and worldwide has gone into a kind of, over the past few years, it's actually collapsed. It's called what they call it? They call it colony collapse disorder. The bee colonies have actually collapsed, and when you look at this has really quite profound economic implications, because it's not just about how much the bees are worth as a self-contained sector in their own right. The reality is that bees actually pollinate 80% of everything we eat. And so an American estimate of how much it actually affects the American economy from the collapse of the bee population in that area actually runs into something in the region of $15 billion. I think in the UK, I think I read something like £140 million. So in other words, I think that this is a very good example of how nature, in the form of bees, natural systems, other species, not just other species, effectively have huge economic role to play, which go completely unrecognised and actually unknown by people. So again, there's very interesting issues here about how you take that economic understanding and then how do you apply it through policy to make things better. Now, one example of that is how, for example, the UK Beekeeping Association has actually used to promote, has used funding and has traded funding for its work, for endorsements that they give to manufacturers of insecticides, and it's the insecticides that basically created the collapse of the bee population in the first place. So there are issues here about, say, the role of insecticides, the role of big companies, and the way things are happening. In the same way that if you look, for example, at the role, for example, of big companies in the control of the food production worldwide, it's a very few small companies who control, say, the seeds, the seed sector, the seeds that are used to plant crops, and grow crops and grow different types of plants. These are controlled quite strongly by very big companies, the grain seeds and so on. And these limit the scope for local producers to be able to produce their own stuff. So there's a huge political economy of food. But in the case of the bee population, what's interesting is that how many people knew that bees sustain about 80% of all the food we eat. That's made possible. And if we didn't have bees, what would replace them? So I think there's this huge economics of bees, but the economics of bees actually runs into billions when you think about it. So that again is very much part of a green economy kind of take or perspective on nature, and it just shows you how important nature is. The other thing another example of that is what people call carbon sequestration services. When you look at the biocapacity of a country or a particular area, it's actually to do with the fact that soils and different forms of vegetation actually sequester carbon, i.e. they store carbon. They take carbon out of the atmosphere, and as a result of which it reduces or mitigates the effects of our own carbon increasing activities. So, for example, it reduces the total volume of carbon given the fact that we emit it from everything else we do, whether it's transport or whether it's using energy in different ways and so on. So these things are very important, carbon sequestration, whether you're looking at the UK in terms of our forests, our different types of soils, our different types of vegetation of all sorts, or you're looking at the Amazon and you're looking at the rainforest worldwide, because it's the same thing. These natural resources, these natural things, trees and so on, have become very important actually to actually mitigating the effects of climate change. And what researchers at Bournemouth University have done, have actually mapped the carbon stock across the southwest region of England, and then using carbon prices have actually come up with quite an enormous number, which actually in many ways you look at and you say, is this just a make-believe number? But it runs in to billions of pounds, and particularly if you take it across the country, as the value of the carbon stocks. So if you were actually to say, oh, that land is worth that much for property development, and you'd say, well, that's not worth that much. But if you look at it in terms of its total ecosystem service value, in other words, its carbon sequestration services on top of the land value, that actually dwarfs the value. It completely dwarfs the value of that land purely as something where you would go and build another house, or you would build a factory, or whatever. So we're underestimating greatly the value of nature. We're underestimating greatly the value of land and soil. We need to think about this in a different way. And if we did, then we'd start thinking quite differently when we come to ecosystem services about all the decisions we're making about how we use the land, and whether we're looking at whether or not the ancient forest should be cut down, how we compensate farmers in the Amazon, and so on. It changes the nature, the very nature of the way we think about the economy. Unfortunately, a lot of these things are not captured by conventional national economic accounts. You don't find that kind of thing in the national economic accounts. We don't value ecosystem services in that way. But there's a lot of research going on, and certainly India, for example, is the first country in the world, one of the big countries, 1 billion people there. Every sixth person in this whole world is Indian. And if you look at it from their perspective, they see trillions in terms of the market for ecosystem services, or the value. And they're the first country in the world that are publishing ecosystems accounts for nature as an economic sector, alongside their conventional economic accounts. So I think this time will come, it'll gradually evolve, but I think that is probably the most interesting and powerful critique, I think, of the way the economy currently works. So that's a lot of work also going on at Bournemouth University. So it's again, it makes the economy and everything we have worth 10 times more. And it would stop us, I think, or at least we would look at decisions about how we're investing, how we're using land far more carefully than before, and particularly in relation to things like knocking down rainforests and so on. And those people we think are not so wealthy, particularly in developing countries, are actually people wealthier than we first thought.